This morning, we're going to learn whether loyalty to the king in a democracy is more than loyalty to the nation. Whether someone in a democracy fulfilling his duty under the Nuremberg principles will continue to be incarcerated. Whether democracy in Australia means the federal police can enter the public broadcaster and go through sensitive news files, seizing them and even making changes to them in the pursuit of those who revealed the gravest crimes. This is what three people in the role of judges will decide this morning inside this building. We're told to respect judges and to follow the law and obey their rulings. That doesn't always mean they're right. Like other members of society, judges grow up conditioned to see the world through eyes that set agendas, and they live and succeed within a system that benefits the powerful. We saw in the travesty in court of the extradition process against John Shipton's son, and John's here with us today. We saw how far judiciary will go, the absurd lengths they'll go to punish someone who challenges power. Rare is the judge who breaks free from the common ground the judiciary shares with the military, with the government, with establishment media, to instead assert democratic values rather than a warped, rules-based order where the rules benefit those who set the order. Rare is the judge who dares find their own government and military partners in preserving this order guilty of crimes against humanity and guilty of crimes of silencing those who speak out against them. Rare, too, is the journalist or politician who puts the public before the military or the king. And even rarer, perhaps, is the lawyer who risked what David McBride risked. These would be rare judges indeed inside who would set him free this morning to come out here to address this gathering. Thank you.
And through Jeff's action, I'm talking about Jeff Morris standing behind me here, there was a Royal Commission into banking and they got a bit of a kick in the head, not hard enough, but he certainly won the war, though many battles were lost, and Jeff paid the price like all whistleblowers. So please give a big welcome to Jeff Morris.
Thank you, Craig. And of course, in war there are casualties. And in whistleblowing, which is a war, there are many casualties, including the whistleblowers' families, who are collateral damage. There's a massive impact on whistleblowers for doing the right thing, speaking truth to power, standing up against powerful institutions like banks or the Catholic Church or the Australian government. And these institutions throw everything at people like David McBride. There's a textbook actually as to how you demean them and belittle them. And that has a tremendous psychological impact on people who try to do the right thing. And it also has an impact on their families. The impact on you, the hardest part of that is seeing how that translates to the impact on your families, which comes in many ways, financial, emotional. Most whistleblowers lose their families in the course of this journey. So there's not a lot of fringe benefits. But I would like to pay tribute to Sarah McBride, who's here today, supporting David, as she always has. And I'm sure that Sarah would agree with what I just said about the impact on families. The impact on David and his two daughters has been terrible. So why do we do this? As I say, there's not many fringe benefits. There's no inducements that I'm aware of to be a whistleblower. There's no rewards in this country, let alone compensation. I think it's a certain sort of person who sees something wrong something very wrong, and regardless of the consequences, and contrary to what a lot of people think, we do go into this with our eyes open. Regardless of those consequences, these people feel they have to tell the truth. And I think the reason is as simple as, if you don't, if when that test comes, you duck it, you run away and hide, then you'd have to live with that for the rest of your life. You wouldn't be able to look yourself in the mirror every morning. So regardless of the consequences, whistleblowers go ahead. And what David saw was a series of inexplicable events in Afghanistan, and in particular conduct by the High Command, by the generals. And we now know, of course, that there were corporals running around all over Afghanistan committing war crimes. The Brereton report has listed 39, although it seems likely that there were more. And the important thing to realise about that is that these war crimes extended over many, many years. Ben Roberts-Smith has been in the news in the last week when another 3 federal court judges, in addition to the original judge in his case, found in a civil case, to the civil standard of proof, which is balance of probabilities. In other words, more likely than not that he murdered 4 Afghans. The significant thing about that is the time frame of those 4 murders extended over 3.5 years. Now, there is no stronger hierarchy than the army. It is a hierarchy. There is a formal rank structure with responsibilities at every level. And this sort of thing, I mean, that's necessary if you're actually going to fight a war, which is a pretty complicated business. So with this extraordinary command and control infrastructure, the generals were running the line for a long time that everything in the garden was lovely in Afghanistan. There were no problems, while there were war crimes being committed under their noses, seemingly. And when the truth finally leaked out, they said, we didn't know anything about it, which is just ludicrous. It's a bit like, it's exactly the same as my situation where when finally they couldn't stop the truth leaking out anymore about the banks, the bank bosses said, oh, we didn't know what was going on down there. We just get paid $10 million a year to sit in our ivory towers and not know what's going on. So there's a lot of people in these institutions who don't want to know about inconvenient truths. So the army, David pieced this together. There was very curious things happening on a sudden change in the rules of engagement in Afghanistan. Teams from Canberra turning up to investigate soldiers, not who were guilty of war crimes, but who were plainly innocent of them. The army were conducting these investigations of innocent soldiers so they could hold up the result and say, look, we investigated this. There was no war crimes going on. Oh, we have zero tolerance. We over-investigate because we're such good guys. And the point of that was to obscure the fact there are a lot of other war crimes, including for their poster boy, Robert Smith, who they'd given the VC to and made a poster boy of. They didn't investigate his matters. So they investigated where they knew they wouldn't find anything. So David slowly pieced this together, and he realised, and this is the crux of the David McBride story. He realised that there was a massive cover-up going on at the highest level to conceal these war crimes. And David has always said, and it's important to understand this, he was not hunting corporals, he was hunting generals. And that is why they've gone after David McBride so viciously, because of the threat that he poses to the establishment. And by the way, it doesn't just extend to the generals. The generals were covering up to give the governments of the day, both Liberal and Labor, what they wanted. They didn't want any embarrassing war crime stories, so the Army made sure they didn't get any. And again, it beggars belief that the Defence Ministers didn't know what was going on, what was being suppressed. So David, out of the whole Army infrastructure, David was the only one who saw this and said this is wrong and did something about it. And he tried to go through channels. He went through the farcical Inspector General of the ADF process and went nowhere. Finally, in desperation, he did exactly what I did at CBA. He leaked documents to the press. Now, I'd spent years, I had spent literally years, nearly 5 years, trying to get our useless corporate regulator in this country, ASIC, to do their job. Finally, I gave all the documents to Adele Ferguson, and having been hammering away at ASIC since 2008, I gave all the documents to a journalist called Adele Ferguson in 2013, and 5 years later we got a Royal Commission. Nothing happened when I was going through channels, or not enough happened anyways, a few token efforts, but nothing of any merit. So this is what happens, and the bureaucracies close ranks, they frustrate you with their inactivity, and then when you say, well, I have to do whatever I have to do to get this problem fixed, then they turn around and say, oh, in David's case, oh, you shouldn't have done that. You should have sat quietly and watched the real crooks continue to cover this up. Now, for your temerity and your integrity in trying to expose the truth, we're now going to charge you with leaking that information, which he had to do, because there was no other way that truth was ever going to see the light of day. Now charge him and imprison him. And this is certainly the most vicious punishment of a whistleblower that I've ever seen, being carried out by the federal government. And frankly, this stinks on so many levels, because not only do they charge him, but then when you get into this court behind me here, they turn up and they took all of his evidence, all the documents he was relying on, and they just say national security.
Shame.
Now, the thing about national security is the government doesn't have to prove that. All they have to do is cite it. So they turn up in court, blokes in suits, national security, we'll take all those documents, thanks. And that's it. There's no avenue of appeal. This is one of the greatest corruptions of our justice system that I've seen in hundreds of years. So effectively it means if you are charged with anything involving national security, the government can rig the case so that you have no chance of defending yourself. And then, you know, they can send you to prison. It's just appalling. So it's a situation where if it involves national security, people lose the basic rights to a fair trial that has been the pillar of British justice for centuries. That all gets thrown in the bin. It's just a disgrace. And then, of course, David is eligible for parole at some point. Guess who determines that? The same guy who charged him, rigged the trial by removing his evidence. You guessed it, the Federal Attorney General gets to decide whether he's eligible for parole. So I wouldn't hold out much hope there. So we're back in court today. Today, another 3 judges of the Supreme Court are going to review what the previous judge did. And I guess, as somebody who studied law 40 years ago, I have certain romantic notions about the law, which I would like to think are still pure, despite all the things that have happened. I'd like to think that the judges inside today will do the right thing and set David free. I hope so. I hope for the best. I plan for the worst. if the court today doesn't get the job done, then we don't give up. There is another court, the highest court in the land, the High Court. And when you're talking about matters of high constitutional law and justice, in many ways it's only the High Court that can really definitively rule on those sort of issues. And that's where we may go, where we may end up. We certainly will go there if we have to. We'll find out today. But once again, here outside this cold and windy court, I think it's important to remember it's not David McBride who's on trial here today. It's the Australian government and the Australian justice system. Once again, they have a choice today. Will they say that the Nazis at Nuremberg got a raw deal? Will they say, because that's effectively what that judgment meant, will they say, no, the Nazis at Nuremberg were right when they said we were just following orders? They should have been acquitted. Nuremberg was a travesty of justice that they were convicted for what they did. Because what they're literally saying to the Australian military is, you don't need to worry about any of that. It's all above your pay grade. You're not paid to think. If you just follow orders, then no matter how, how wrong they may seem to you, then that's all you have to do, and you will be able to successfully argue the just following orders defence that the Nazis tried on at Nuremberg. So that's where we are today, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I hope the justice system acquits itself better than it did the last time we were here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. Jeff's a legend for us, and along with his good mate Troy, who couldn't make it today, unfortunately. He does send his apologies. He's receiving treatment up in Merriwa. But it's great to see guys like Jeff and Troy who've been knocked down, but they've got back up every time, and they're now out speaking for people like David. Now, Jeff mentioned what happened here. A lot of people think David blew the whistle on war criminals. It was actually the brass, the government and the AFP who colluded to cover up the war crimes and then investigate people unfairly to get some runs on the board. I'll just read a quick excerpt from David's book for you, if you allow me. Now, there was an incident in Afghanistan, I think it was 2009-10, when David was over there acting as a legal representative for the SAS. Now, this guy, his name was Beachy, he and another Australian guy and a tribe of the local Afghani military and a translator had captured 3 suspected Taliban insurgents. At one point, they were going to get on a helicopter and take these men back to base and process them. During one of these transfers, there were 2 men, Australian SAS, with including Beachy and 1 small Taliban suspect and a translator. They went into a cowshed for a bit of a break before the chopper came, and as the guy was cuffed behind, it's hard to get him on a helicopter, and he was uncomfortable and he couldn't sit down and rest. So one guy dropped out to relieve himself. Beachy was there by himself with a translator, and he uncuffed the guy to flip his cuffs around to the front. The guy saw an opportunity, went for his gun, and there was a 10-15 second desperate wrestle. Beachy, being trained and a little bit more powerful, managed to get the gun round, and he killed the insurgent. Tragic, but it was a legitimate kill, as they say. Now, as Jeff mentioned, our government got all concerned about war crimes, so they sent across a senior investigator. He's actually the ex-ADF chief, a guy called Mark Binskin. You may remember him. I'll just sidetrack. You remember we had a lovely young Australian lady who was killed in Gaza last year on the 2nd of April. Zomi Frankom, working for the Food Aid Group, and she was gunned down, assassinated by the Israeli Defence Force. There was some outrage here, so we sent across an investigator. And guess who they sent? You got it right, Mark Binskin. Have we heard anything about that? Nothing. and very similar to what happened in Afghanistan. So I'll just quickly read this last page of David's book. So the guy had been processed, Beachy, and accused of murder by the Binskin investigation. So towards the end of the investigation, soon afterwards, I received the incident report from the staff captain. It was well written and its conclusions were logical, as in it was a legitimate kill. It seemed there was nothing to suggest that Beachy hadn't acted in self-defence. I gave the report to the CO, it's the commanding officer, who agreed with its findings. Then he sent it to Canberra. Hours later, there'd been significant developments, and I called the SAS Sergeant Major and asked him to send Beachy up. Beachy knocked on my thick steel door and came into my cargo container office. I explained to him that despite the fact the CO had argued strongly against it and that the CO had supported him, the generals in Canberra were sending a team to investigate him for murder. There was no easy way to put it. Beachy didn't say anything, just gave me a look. It was only a look, but I'd been around long enough to know what that look meant. Yes, it's political bullshit, I said with a sigh, not taking the easy option of looking away. While I didn't bother saying anything to win his approval, it burnt me all the more that I'd been fighting hard against the same political bullshit for the last 6 months. But I didn't need to tell him about fighting. He'd done 6 long, dangerous deployments for his country, so whatever efforts I'd made weren't much in comparison. Then he said the words I'll never forget. David, isn't it your job to stop the political bullshit? I sighed, dropped eye contact for the first time. All sorts of defensive answers were coming up in my brain, but before I could choose any of them, I gave in to the only one that was true. I knew he was right. Yes, it is, David said. We discussed a few of the details about the interviews with the police that would take place when they arrived. But from that moment on, I knew exactly what my duty was. And that's why David's upstairs now and why he's spending more than a year and 2 weeks in the prison down here. So it's shameful. Now we have a very special guest today, Mr. Bill Brown. He's got a pretty lengthy resume here. If I can just give you a quick brief on Bill. So Bill's from the Australia Institute, which is a great organisation a lot of us follow. He's the director of the Democracy and Accountability Program at the Aussie Institute, and his diverse area of interest include the use of opinion polling, forecasting to predict policy outcomes and truth in political advertising reforms. So he's worked all over the place in many states and in the Senate in Australia Democracy. Prior to coming to the Australian Institute, he worked as an environmental, social, governance, ESGN. So please give a big welcome to Bill.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for turning out today. A democracy that retaliates against whistleblowers is a pretty poor democracy. Our system depends on people casting an informed vote on the basis of what the government has done in their name. If we don't hear about the abuses of power, the cruel indifference, the failed programs, the alleged war crimes, then we cannot meaningfully cast judgment. We pay for this wrongdoing with public money, and we implicitly endorse it with our votes. It happens in our name, but we are kept in the dark. By extension, wrongdoers can escape accountability by creating a culture of fear where people are afraid to speak out. Corruption, maladministration, fraud, and cruel bureaucratic indifference can escape notice. In the robo-debt scheme, the government illegally shook down some of the poorest and most vulnerable in our society for money that they didn't owe. Those responsible have mostly escaped justice, even today. Those who should have spoke up mostly didn't, and those who did were at best ignored. As long as governments remain fearful of transparency and wrathful towards truth tellers, the threat of another robo-debt remains. In the case of the war in Afghanistan, voters were already 2 steps removed from any kind of control or ability to hold decision makers to account. Even our elected representatives in the parliament did not get a vote on the war and did not even debate it until 9 years after it had begun. But the alleged murder of civilians in Afghanistan occurred in our name nonetheless. The desecrations of their bodies happened in our name. What makes the prosecutions of David McBride and Richard Boyle so upsetting is that we know that they are being punished under flawed whistleblowing laws. The Albanese government knows that the whistleblowing laws are flawed. We know that they know because they've told us as much. And yet they allow the lives of whistleblowers to be damaged or ruined by unjust laws. They had an entire term of 3 years to fix the laws and only passed one relatively minor tranche of changes. That's a conscious decision. It's a sin of omission rather than commission, which makes it politically palatable but no more morally justifiable. And this from a government that promised transparency. Secrecy is not security. The keeping of secrets does not make the Australian public safer. And this applies not just to whistleblowing, but across the board. The lack of respect for freedom of information laws, the failure to answer the questions even of parliamentarians when asked, and advice to public servants on how to evade the answering of these questions. The use of national security as a blanket way of avoiding accountability and public debate. And we know the government could move quickly when it wants to. When it comes to extra taxpayer funding for political parties or restricting the right to protest, the legislative process is measured in days or weeks, not years. Several years ago now, the Australia Institute produced a podcast, How to Make a Whistleblower, about what it takes to become a whistleblower and what happens next. It was with a colleague at the time of mine, Marianne Slattery, who blew the whistle in the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. And this title, How to Make a Whistleblower, is, I think, a subtle but provocative one. Because, of course, on one level, what it takes to make a whistleblower is tremendous courage, honesty, a dedication to the truth and to public service, selflessness, because the consequences for whistleblowing can be so serious. We see that today. We see that with many whistleblowers, even those who are not prosecuted. The damage done to their health, to their relationships, to their earning potential, as well as to their liberty. But I think How to Make a Whistleblower has another answer as well, because on another level, what it takes to make a whistleblower is wrongdoing. It's corruption, malfeasance, maladministration, cruelty, and lawlessness. Whistleblowers only exist because the system is broken and only exist where the system is broken. And a failure to recognise and protect whistleblowers only helps those who benefit from a broken system. Ultimately, it is we, the public, who suffers, which raises the question of who benefits. And I wanted to end my remarks by sharing some polling research that the Australia Institute conducted with Kieran Pender of the Human Rights Law Centre and the Whistleblower Justice Fund. We released it last month, and you can find the full details on our websites. And I hope that from this polling research, the government sees the strength of Australian support for whistleblowers and feels pressure to act. But I want to share the research with you, not to convince you of anything, but to hearten you. It can be lonely being an activist. It can be lonely speaking out about these kinds of things. But your cause is popular among the Australian public, and getting more so. So our research finds that 86% of Australians support having stronger legal protections for Australian whistleblowers, and more than half, 52%, strongly support such protections. There's majority support for these protections across all voting intentions. It's not limited to one side of politics or the other. 4 in 5 Australians, 81%, think whistleblowers make Australia a better place, and only 5% think they make Australia worse. 84% support the introduction of a whistleblower protection authority. Only 5% oppose. And 7 in 10 Australians, 68%, agree that the Australian government should pardon David McBride. And even more heartening is that support is up. 4 years ago, when we asked these questions again, 73% supported stronger protections for whistleblowers. Today, it is 86%. That's about 2 million more voters supporting protections than did 4 years ago. Support for a whistleblower protection authority, already high, is up 5 percentage points. That's roughly 1 million more Australians. So you're winning popular opinion. But the personal cost of those victories is appalling and should never have been needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Bill Brown from the Australia Institute. That's positive information there that the tide is turning. I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Craig Andrews. I work with Marie Ryan. We're the co-conveners of AAPP, Tall Banner, the Alliance Against Political Prosecutions. If you'd like to join us or just get on our newsletters or whatever, there's cards here. You can come pick up contacts. And we also thank you all. Big thanks to Andrew for bringing the truck up this morning. You had to break the ice in the Middle to get here. And our wonderful supporters from Melbourne, the coast, Sydney, and further about. So thank you very much for coming. Our next speaker is a very special lady, Kathryn Kelly. She was the inaugural convener of the Alliance Against Political Prosecutions, which initially helped to get Bernard Collaery off his charges. Kathryn's a very, very active person with the IPAN organisation, a great friend of Palestine and supporter for the genocide, or to stop the genocide. And she's been very active in our group for many years until we took over, but she's still active. So please welcome Kathryn Kelly. She's done a lot of other things as well.
Thank you, Craig. It's very good to be here. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous people of this land, the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and pay respects to their elders, past and present. And also to acknowledge that they suffered a genocide. And just as other Indigenous people around the world have too. Our country, a settler colonial country, along with the US, Canada, UK, and most recently, Israel. All these settler colonial countries tried to get rid of their Indigenous people. They didn't succeed, and they won't succeed in Palestine, I believe, as well. So what is happening there is absolutely outrageous and must be stopped. But it is genocide. But to get back to David, which is why we're here today, as you know, on the 14th of May, David McBride was convicted on a number of charges resulting from his passing of documents to the ABC, which they made into the Afghanistan files. He was sentenced to a sentence of nearly 6 years and has served over 1 year for doing the right thing. This is a huge injustice. There are 3 contentious aspects to the McBride case. Firstly, Justice Mossop's ruling that personnel in the Australian Defence Force have no higher duty than to obey commands to the exclusion of truth-telling and wrongdoing. Secondly, that this duty to obey commands downgrades the public's right to know to an irrelevancy. Thirdly, the above 2 rulings will severely damage the standing of Australian law and the Australian Defence Force. Consequently, democracy in Australia has now been diminished and eroded to the point that our country has been taken on an authoritarian course in respect to these matters. When Justice Mossop dismissed McBride's public interest defence, he dismissed the purpose of the Nuremberg rulings. Soldiers, when committing war crimes, cannot rely on the mantra, "I was only carrying out orders." Furthermore, he did not explain how he came to this decision. Quite likely, he couldn't justify it. David leaked documents to the ABC after his military superiors wantonly ignored war crimes by our soldiers. He had no alternative but to release this credible evidence of war crimes committed by the Australian forces in Afghanistan. It was public interest journalism at its best. That is the Afghan Files report. And yet the first person imprisoned in relation to Australia's war crimes is not a war criminal, but the whistleblower. Shame indeed. Whistleblower legal protection is now widely considered bankrupt and a mockery, as Bill has just explained. The ALP had a great opportunity to fix that, and they didn't. They basically refused. Those brave enough to be whistleblowers exposing government misconduct, military malfeasance, corporate corruption, to ensure accountability and justice, and thereby protecting victims and the public good, are the beacons of democracy. We demand an end to the unjust treatment of the courageous whistleblower, David McBride, and also Richard Boyle. David's conviction and sentencing has no doubt already been a powerful deterrent to other potential whistleblowers from speaking up through fear of prosecution. Consequently, the community suffers in general, and victims of wrongdoing in particular. Protection of whistleblowers is the litmus test of democracy. Australia now has a poor record in this matter, as the case of David McBride bears witness. So what should we do about it? There are many great organisations around the country trying to address these and other injustices. The Australia Institute gives us fantastic webinars and information on so many issues. The Independent and Peaceful Australia Network is working to try and change our national security so that it's not dependent and relying on the US. We have found currently that that is the wrong way to go. The Australian Peace and Security Forum is a new organisation trying to widen the definition of national security to include climate, housing, domestic violence, all these things that affect people's daily security. Should have a look at their website. And I also want to mention the Human Rights Law Centre, which does a great job for whistleblowers. And I saw Kieran Pender here a little while ago, but I think he might have gone in. But all these organisations and many more grassroots organisations, such as the Canberra Palestinian Action Group, who are organising rallies to defend Palestinians, are all doing what they can to try and make our world better. So if you can support them, if you can write to the Attorney General asking her to drop the charges on David McBride, or not drop the charges, to pardon him, and same with Richard Boyle, to stop that case in Adelaide going on at the moment, and also to stop the extradition of Dan Duggan, another huge injustice. I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Kathryn Kelly. Just quickly, of course, our group's also looking after Richard Boyle. We're trying to get his charges dismissed, and Dan Duggan, who's been locked up for nearly 1,000 days without charge, awaiting extradition to the US, an Australian citizen. Our very special person is going to finish up this morning for us. He doesn't need an introduction, but he's a wonderful man who's dedicated his life to freeing his son, Julian Assange, who spent 13 years in detention for the same kind of thing that we're dealing with here today. So with no further ado, please welcome Mr. John Shipton.
A couple of years ago with the senior counsel, we were approaching the Attorney General's building, and I turned to him and said, how many people work in here? And he replied, just under half. I'd like to take a different approach to David and his troubles and assert firmly that David McBride is a historical figure. And you can see for yourself the effects of David's revelations about Afghanistan moving through society. First of all, the biggest catch was hurled the Governor-General. They got rid of him. They do it silently. They don't want to disturb the filaments of authority that hold a society together, but nonetheless they did it. They got rid of that chap. Lately, we see Ben Roberts-Smith in a civic case. The movement is towards understanding what Robert Smith and the others did in Afghanistan. The next one is ISR, Intelligence, Surveillance and Reconnaissance. Any proposition that has the cadre officers unable to supervise the NCOs and the soldiery, any proposition that fails to address ISR, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, is treating us like morons. That's their singular job, is to organise the work, what they call the work that the troops do. So you can see that David's effect permeates permanently through the organisation of our institutions of state. This is an important understanding. Don't diminish anything that David has effected by simply saying he's in jail. Don't do that. The next thing. In 2000, after the Taliban had taken over, the United Nations revealed that the Taliban had reduced the opium production to 10 to 12% of world opium production. The United States invaded. Opium production rose to 82 and then to 90% of world production. That is under the supervision of the United States in its invasion, which included Australia. The production of opium in Afghanistan rose to 90% of world production. In 2016, Douglas McGregor was National Security Advisor to the first Trump administration, charged with removing the occupation of Afghanistan by the United States, confounded by the fact that 5,000 of the troops in Afghanistan were actually contractors of one sort or another. To be revealed to us what a vile and wretched thing the occupation of Afghanistan was, and how it infected the Australian troops who were part of that occupation. And David's work revealed to us and continues to reveal to us what the occupation of Afghanistan actually was. The abandonment of the occupation, you can say this of it and say it firmly. The abandonment of the occupation, the removal of troops, depended upon the growth of fentanyl as a substitute for opium. So fentanyl through Mexico was a cheaper and more powerful product, more controllable because it was all developed in the laboratory. So the occupation of Afghanistan no longer provided money, and no longer, because of the defences of the Russian Federation and the Iranian Republic, no longer was able to penetrate and debauch those societies. It was a policy of debauching the youth of the Russian Federation, of Afghanistan, of Iran, by the introduction of opium, a policy. It had policy documents, it had support, it had money flows, it had laboratories, it had distribution networks.
Shame. Absolutely.
So David McBride is an Australian of significance, of historical significance. Give him that pride.
Yeah.